The morning sun cast long shadows across the rugged mountains of Afghanistan as Staff Sergeant Maria Rodriguez adjusted her scope for the third time. 2 miles away, through the crystal-clear mountain air, she could see the small outpost where her fellow rangers were conducting their routine patrol. What none of them knew was that today would become anything but routine. Maria had been positioned on the rocky outcrop since before dawn, part of an overwatch mission designed to provide security for the patrol below. Her Barrett M82 sniper rifle lay steady on its bipod, the powerful scope giving her a clear view of the valley floor where Bravo team was moving through a small village. The mission seemed straightforward enough: gather intelligence, check in with local contacts, and return to base before the afternoon heat became unbearable. The radio crackled softly in her ear as Team Leader Sergeant Johnson reported their position. Everything was going according to plan. Maria swept her scope across the surrounding terrain, looking for any signs of movement or potential threats. The mountains were known for harboring insurgent fighters, but the area had been quiet for weeks. That's when she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Small groups of armed men were moving through the rocks and ravines surrounding the village, staying low and using the terrain to mask their approach. Maria quickly counted at least 15 fighters visible from her position, and she knew there were likely more hidden from her view. She immediately keyed her radio. Overwatch to Bravo team. You've got movement in the hills. Multiple armed individuals converging on your position. Sergeant Johnson's voice came back steady but concerned. Copy that, Overwatch. Can you get a count? Maria continued scanning, her heart rate increasing as she spotted more and more fighters. They were moving with practiced coordination, clearly experienced in mountain warfare. Some carried AK-47 rifles. Others had rocket-propelled grenades. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a carefully planned ambush. Bravo team. I count at least 30 fighters. Possibly more. They're surrounding your position from the north, east, and west ridgelines. Recommend immediate extraction. But before Johnson could respond, the first shots rang out. Muzzle flashes erupted from multiple positions as the insurgents opened fire on the exposed patrol below. Maria watched through her scope as her fellow rangers scrambled for cover behind mud brick walls and abandoned vehicles in the village square. Taking fire! Taking fire! Johnson's voice cut through the radio static. We're pinned down in the village center. Request immediate support. Maria could see the desperate situation unfolding below. Her team was trapped in an open area with minimal cover, while the enemy held the high ground on 3 sides. The insurgents were methodically closing in, using suppressing fire to keep the rangers pinned, while other fighters moved to better positions. Through her scope, Maria began identifying targets. The enemy fighters were confident, some even standing partially exposed as they fired down into the village. They clearly believed they had the upper hand with their superior numbers and positioning. What they didn't know was that Maria Rodriguez was one of the most skilled marksmen in the entire regiment. She had grown up hunting with her father in the mountains of Colorado, learning to shoot at long distances where a single shot had to count. Years of military training had refined those skills to a razor's edge. At 2 miles, most people couldn't even see individual figures clearly. But Maria could distinguish between different weapons and identify specific threats. The radio crackled again with increasing urgency. Overwatch! We need support now. They're moving closer, and we're running low on ammunition. Maria could hear the sounds of gunfire echoing across the valley, punctuated by the occasional explosion of a grenade. She watched as one of her teammates, Corporal Williams, was hit in the shoulder and dragged behind cover by his squadmate. The situation was deteriorating rapidly. She knew that calling for air support or reinforcements would take at least 30 minutes, possibly longer given their remote location. The Rangers below didn't have 30 minutes. They might not have 10 minutes if the insurgents continued their coordinated advance. Maria made a decision that would define her military career. She was going to engage targets at maximum range, something that required not just exceptional marksmanship, but also precise calculations for wind, elevation, and atmospheric conditions. At 2 miles, a bullet would take several seconds to reach its target, and even a slight miscalculation could mean the difference between hitting an enemy fighter and missing entirely. She quickly adjusted her scope settings and began calculating the various factors that would affect her shots. The wind was relatively calm, which was fortunate. But the distance meant she would need to aim significantly higher than her target to account for bullet drop. The thin mountain air would affect the bullet's trajectory differently than at sea level. Her first target was a fighter with an RPG who had positioned himself on a rocky ledge overlooking the village. If he managed to get a clear shot, he could devastate the Rangers' defensive position. Maria centered her crosshairs, adjusted for the distance and conditions, and slowly squeezed the trigger. The massive rifle bucked against her shoulder, and she immediately worked the bolt to chamber another round while keeping her eye on the target. Several seconds passed, an eternity in combat, before she saw the insurgent suddenly collapse and tumble from his position. Her first shot had found its mark. The other fighters hadn't yet realized what had happened. From their perspective, their comrade had simply fallen, possibly from enemy fire, from the village below. But Maria was already acquiring her second target, another RPG operator who was setting up on the opposite ridge. Her second shot was just as precise as the first, dropping the threat before he could fire his rocket. Now the insurgents were beginning to realize that someone was engaging them from long range. But they couldn't determine where the shots were coming from. The sound of the rifle was echoing off the mountain walls, making it difficult to pinpoint Maria's position. This confusion worked to her advantage. While the enemy fighters tried to locate the source of the deadly accurate fire, Maria continued to methodically eliminate the most dangerous targets. Each shot required careful calculation and perfect execution, but her training had prepared her for exactly this type of high-pressure situation. The radio chatter from below was becoming more hopeful as the Rangers realized they had support from somewhere in the mountains. "Somebody's engaging the enemy positions," Johnson reported. "Long-range fire, extremely accurate. Some of the pressure is coming off." Maria continued her deadly work, prioritizing targets based on the immediate threat they posed to her teammates below. Machine gunners, RPG operators, and fighters in commanding positions all fell to her precise fire. With each successful shot, the tactical situation shifted more in favor of the surrounded Rangers. But Maria knew she was fighting against time. Eventually, the insurgents would either locate her position or successfully coordinate their attack. Despite her intervention, she needed to buy enough time for proper reinforcements to arrive, and that meant maintaining her incredible rate of accurate fire at an almost impossible distance. The battle for the lives of Bravo team had only just begun, and everything would depend on Maria's ability to continue hitting targets that most snipers would consider beyond effective range. The next few minutes would test every skill she had developed over years of training and prove whether one soldier with exceptional marksmanship could truly change the course of a battle against overwhelming odds. 20 minutes into the firefight, Maria had eliminated 8 high-value targets. But the insurgents were adapting to her long-range threat. She watched through her scope as enemy fighters began moving more cautiously, using better cover, and coordinating their movements to minimize exposure. They had figured out the general direction of her fire and were trying to locate her exact position. The situation for Bravo team remained critical despite her intervention. While she had removed many of the most dangerous threats, there were still dozens of fighters maintaining pressure on the surrounded Rangers. Worse, she could see additional insurgents arriving from the south, apparently reinforcements called in when the ambush began taking unexpected casualties. "Overwatch, what's your ammunition status?" Johnson's voice came through the radio during a brief lull in the firing. Maria quickly counted her remaining rounds. She had started with 20 rounds of .50 caliber ammunition, and each shot had to count at this extreme range. 12 rounds remaining, she reported back, the weight of that number settling heavily on her shoulders. "Copy that. We've got more fighters moving in from the south. Air support is still 20 minutes out. Can you hold them?" Through her scope, Maria could see the new group of insurgents. At least 15 more fighters, with heavy weapons. They were moving to cut off any possible escape route for the trapped Rangers. If they succeeded in completely surrounding the village, Even air support might not be enough to save her teammates. She had to make a decision about how to use her remaining ammunition most effectively. Continuing to pick off individual targets would help, but it wouldn't stop the overall coordination of the attack. She needed to disrupt their command structure and break their organized assault. Maria began scanning for high-value leadership targets. In her experience, insurgent groups typically had field commanders who coordinated attacks from positions where they could observe the battlefield while remaining relatively safe. She looked for fighters who weren't actively shooting but seemed to be directing others or communicating via radio. She found what she was looking for on the northern ridge. A bearded man in slightly better equipment than the others, holding a radio and pointing out positions to nearby fighters. He was positioned behind a large boulder that provided excellent cover from the village below, but left him partially exposed to Maria's elevated position. The shot would be challenging even by her standards. The target was mostly concealed, offering only a small portion of his torso as a viable target. The wind had picked up slightly, adding another variable to her calculations. But if she could eliminate what appeared to be a key leader, it might create enough confusion to disrupt their coordinated attack. Maria adjusted her aim point carefully, accounting for all the environmental factors and the extreme distance. She controlled her breathing, waiting for the natural pause between heartbeats when her body would be most stable. The squeeze of the trigger was smooth and deliberate. The bullet's flight time at 2 miles seemed endless, but Maria maintained her sight picture to observe the impact. Through her scope, she saw the target suddenly jerk and fall backward behind the boulder. Almost immediately, she noticed a change in the insurgents' behavior. Without their field commander's directions, several fighters seemed uncertain about their next moves. But her success came with a cost. The muzzle flash and sound signature from her position had finally given the enemy a better idea of where she was located. She saw several fighters on the eastern ridge, turning their weapons in her direction and beginning to fire. Bullets began snapping through the air around her position, some striking the rocks nearby with sharp cracks and whining ricochets. Maria quickly relocated to a secondary firing position she had identified earlier, moving about 50 meters to a different outcropping that offered similar fields of view but changed her angle relative to the enemy fighters. The movement probably saved her life, as concentrated fire began hitting her previous position just moments after she vacated it. From her new position, she could see that the removal of the field commander had indeed created some confusion among the insurgent forces. But they were still maintaining pressure on the Rangers below. She had to continue eliminating threats while staying ahead of their attempts to locate and neutralize her. Her next target was a machine gunner who had set up in a position that allowed him to sweep the main street of the village where several Rangers were pinned down. The heavy machine gun was keeping her teammates from maneuvering to better positions and was slowly chipping away at their cover. This shot presented a different challenge. The machine gunner was actively firing, which meant he was focused on his target and less likely to move unexpectedly, but it also meant he was in a more stable firing position. Maria would have to time her shot for when he paused to reload or adjust his aim. She waited patiently, watching the pattern of his fire through her scope. After several bursts, she saw him shift positions slightly to get a better angle on the Ranger's position. That moment of movement and repositioning gave her the opportunity she needed. The shot broke cleanly, and she watched as the machine gunner slumped over his weapon. The immediate suppression of that gun position allowed the Rangers below to move to better cover and begin returning more effective fire against other enemy positions. "Good shot, Overwatch," came Johnson's voice over the radio. "That MG was tearing us up. We're able to maneuver now." But Maria could see new problems developing. The southern group of reinforcements had reached positions where they could begin their own assault on the village. These fighters appeared better equipped and more disciplined than the original ambush force. Some carried newer weapons and were using more sophisticated tactics. More concerning, she spotted what appeared to be a sniper among the southern group. Through her scope, she could see a fighter with a scoped rifle, taking up a concealed position with a clear view of the village. If an enemy sniper engaged the Rangers from that position while they were already under fire from multiple directions, it could be devastating. The enemy sniper represented Maria's highest priority target, but he was also likely to be her most challenging shot. Unlike the other fighters, this individual would understand long-range shooting and would be using proper concealment techniques. He would present only minimal target exposure and would be expecting counter-sniper fire. Maria studied the enemy sniper's position carefully, looking for any weakness in his concealment. She could see just the outline of his shoulder and part of his rifle scope glinting in the sunlight. It would require her most precise shot yet, at maximum range, against a target that was actively trying not to be seen. She made minute adjustments to her scope settings and double-checked her range estimation. The enemy sniper was actually slightly further away than most of her previous targets, pushing the envelope of what was possible with her equipment and ammunition. As she prepared for the shot, Maria could see the enemy sniper settling into his firing position and beginning to scan the village for targets. Time was running out. Once he began engaging the Rangers with precision fire, the tactical situation would become desperate. The shot had to be perfect. There would be no second chance against this target, and the lives of her entire team might depend on this single bullet finding its mark across more than 2 miles of mountain terrain. Maria steadied herself, controlled her breathing, and began her final trigger squeeze. The massive rifle recoiled against her shoulder, and she immediately began scanning to observe the impact. For several heart-stopping seconds, she couldn't tell if she had hit the target. Then she saw movement, the enemy sniper's rifle falling from its position and sliding down the rocky slope. But her relief was short-lived. The sustained firefight and her continued engagement had finally allowed the insurgents to triangulate her position with enough accuracy to bring effective fire against her. Bullets were now hitting all around her new position, some coming close enough that she could feel the displacement of air as they passed. She had perhaps 8 rounds remaining, and the enemy was getting closer to pinpointing her exact location. The situation was becoming untenable, but the Rangers below were still completely surrounded and desperately needed her continued support. Maria had to decide whether to relocate again, potentially losing precious time and ammunition, or continue engaging from her increasingly dangerous position. The radio crackled with an urgent transmission that would change everything. All units. This is Falcon 1-2. We are 10 minutes out with close air support. Overwatch. Can you mark enemy positions for airstrikes? Air support was finally close enough to matter, but Maria realized she had a new mission. Instead of just eliminating individual threats, she now needed to help guide precision airstrikes against the remaining insurgent positions. This would require her to stay in position despite the increasing enemy fire and use her remaining ammunition to mark the most important targets for the incoming aircraft. The final phase of the battle was about to begin, and everything would depend on Maria's ability to survive the next 10 minutes while providing crucial targeting information for the air support that could finally turn the tide in favor of the surrounded Rangers. The sound of approaching aircraft engines could be heard echoing off the mountain walls as Maria prepared for the most critical phase of the engagement. She had 8 rounds left, and each one would need to serve a dual purpose, eliminating immediate threats to the Rangers while marking key enemy positions for the incoming airstrikes. Overwatch, this is Falcon 1-2, came the pilot's voice over the radio. We need you to designate priority targets. We can see the general area, but need specific locations for precision strikes. Maria quickly assessed the battlefield through her scope. The insurgents had consolidated into 3 main groups, one on the northern ridge, one on the eastern slope, and the reinforcement group that had taken positions to the south. Each group contained between 10 and 15 fighters, and they were all maintaining pressure on the surrounded Rangers. Falcon 1-2, I'll mark targets with tracer fire, Maria responded. Northern Ridge has the largest concentration, approximately 15 fighters with heavy weapons. Eastern Slope has a machine gun nest that's been suppressing our ground team. Southern Position has the freshest fighters with the best equipment. The first priority was the Northern Ridge, where the largest group of insurgents had taken cover behind a cluster of large boulders. These fighters had been in the battle longest and were running low on ammunition. But they still posed the greatest immediate threat due to their numbers and commanding position overlooking the village. Maria chambered one of her few remaining tracer rounds, special ammunition designed to burn brightly and mark targets for air support. The shot would need to be precise, not just to hit near the enemy position, but to clearly indicate the center of their defensive cluster for the pilot above. She aimed for a point just above the main boulder cluster, where most of the muzzle flashes had been originating. The tracer round streaked across the valley like a burning arrow, striking the rocks and creating a bright flare that would be clearly visible from the aircraft. Good mark, Overwatch. Northern Ridge is marked. Beginning our attack run. The first airstrike was devastating in its precision. The guided missile struck exactly where Maria's tracer had indicated, sending a massive explosion rolling across the northern ridge. Through her scope, she could see that the blast had eliminated most of the fighters in that position, with any survivors fleeing toward the rear. But her success came at a cost. The tracer round had given away her exact position to any remaining insurgents, and she immediately began taking concentrated fire from multiple directions. Rock chips and dust filled the air around her, as bullets struck her cover with increasing accuracy. Moving to alternate position, she radioed, as she quickly gathered her equipment and low-crawled to yet another firing point. This third position was more exposed but offered the best fields of view for marking the remaining enemy locations. From her new vantage point, Maria could see that the elimination of the northern group had dramatically changed the tactical situation. The Rangers below were no longer taking fire from that direction and had been able to consolidate their defensive positions. But the eastern and southern groups were still actively engaged and would need to be dealt with before the rescue could be completed. The eastern machine gun position was her next priority. These fighters had found an excellent defensive position in a series of connected rock formations that provided both cover and clear fields of fire into the village. The machine gun crew had been methodically targeting anything that moved in the Rangers' defensive perimeter. Maria loaded another tracer round and aimed for the center of the rock formation where she had observed the heaviest concentration of fire. The distance and angle were challenging, but she had been engaging targets in this area throughout the battle and had a good understanding of the range and wind conditions. The tracer struck perfectly, burning brightly against the dark rocks, and clearly marking the position for the circling aircraft. Within minutes, a second precision strike eliminated the machine gun nest and scattered the remaining fighters in that sector. "Excellent work, Overwatch," the pilot reported. 2 targets neutralized. "What's your assessment of the southern group?" Maybe. Through her scope, Maria could see that the southern insurgents were beginning to withdraw. The devastating accuracy of the airstrikes had apparently convinced them that continuing the fight was hopeless. However, several fighters were still in positions where they could threaten the Rangers if they attempted to move from the village. She had 6 rounds remaining, and the decision of how to use them required careful consideration. The air support could handle large groups, but individual fighters in good concealment might escape the airstrikes and continue to pose a threat during the extraction. Maria decided to use her remaining ammunition to eliminate specific high-value targets that might evade the airstrikes. She identified a fighter with an RPG who was repositioning to get a shot at the expected rescue helicopters, and another insurgent who appeared to be coordinating the withdrawal and might reorganize the survivors for another attack. Her shot at the RPG operator was clean and final. The insurgent dropped his weapon and collapsed behind his cover, eliminating the anti-aircraft threat before it could engage the rescue birds. The second target, the apparent leader, required a more challenging shot as he moved between covered positions. Maria waited patiently for him to expose himself, knowing that she might only get one opportunity. When he stepped into the open to signal to other fighters, she was ready. The shot dropped him immediately, creating visible confusion among the remaining insurgents. Falcon 1-2. Southern targets are breaking contact and withdrawing. Recommend final strike on their rally point to prevent reorganization. The pilot acknowledged and delivered the final airstrike against the southern group staging area, ensuring that any survivors would be unable to mount another coordinated attack. As the explosions echoed across the valley and smoke rose from the enemy positions, an unusual quiet settled over the battlefield. For the first time in over an hour, there was no incoming fire directed at the Rangers in the village below. "All stations, this is Bravo team leader." Johnson's voice came over the radio. Calmer now, but still tense. "Immediate threats have been neutralized. We have wounded that need medical evacuation. But we can hold position for extraction. Maria surveyed the battlefield through her scope one final time. Scattered groups of insurgents could be seen retreating into the deeper mountains. But the organized threat had been completely broken. The ambush that should have overwhelmed the small patrol had been turned into a devastating defeat for the attackers. The rescue helicopters arrived 20 minutes later, their rotors beating a steady rhythm as they settled into the village landing zone. Maria watched through her scope as her fellow rangers, including the wounded, were loaded aboard for evacuation to the forward operating base. Overwatch. This is Bravo Team Leader, Johnson called as the helicopters prepared to depart. Outstanding work today. That was some of the finest shooting I've ever witnessed. You saved our lives. Maria packed up her equipment methodically, ensuring that nothing was left behind that could compromise future operations. As she prepared to move to her own extraction point, she reflected on the engagement that had just concluded. 50 insurgent fighters had attempted to overwhelm 7 rangers in a carefully planned ambush. They had chosen their ground well, used good tactics, and should have succeeded in their mission. Instead, precise long-range fire from a single sniper had disrupted their coordination, eliminated their key leaders, and provided the crucial time needed for air support to arrive. The official after-action report would later confirm that Maria had eliminated 14 enemy fighters with 18 shots at ranges between 1,800 and 2,200 meters. More importantly, her intervention had saved the lives of 7 fellow soldiers who would have been overrun without her support. As Maria made her way down the mountain toward her extraction point, she could hear the distant sound of helicopters carrying her teammates to safety. The mission that had started as a routine patrol had become one of the most challenging combat engagements of the deployment. But it had ended with every ranger accounted for and returning home. Years later, Maria would receive the Silver Star for her actions that day. But she always insisted that she had simply done her job. She had been in the right place at the right time with the right skills to make a difference. In her mind, there had been no choice but to engage the enemy and protect her fellow soldiers, regardless of the odds or the distance involved. The story of the day when Rangers radioed that they were surrounded by 50 enemies, only to be saved by precise fire from 2 miles away, would become part of military legend. It demonstrated that in combat, superior marksmanship, quick thinking, and unwavering dedication to fellow soldiers could overcome even overwhelming numerical disadvantages. For the Rangers who lived through that engagement, it proved that they could count on their teammates to move heaven and earth to bring them home safely, no matter how desperate the situation might seem. Maria Rodriguez had taken on 50 enemies from 2 miles away and emerged victorious, ensuring that a routine patrol didn't become a tragedy and that 7 soldiers returned home to their families.